Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's edition of Founder Fridays. I'm Ashley Francisco, and I lead Google's startup ecosystem efforts across Canada. And I'm so excited for today's event. Founder Fridays is a recurring monthly event series that we host for founders and startup teams across the Americas to bring the best of Google to you and your teams. Last year, over 3,000 startups joined us from more than 80 countries across the globe. So go ahead and introduce yourselves and your startup in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. Today, we'll explore managing and scaling products. As a founder, it's important to understand how to build and scale your products to meet your customers' needs. This session will equip you with the tools and strategies to work productively with your engineering team, create a product roadmap, and to build for scale with platforms like Firebase. First, we'll hear lightning talks from Google experts. Drew Bradstock, product director of Google's Kubernetes engine, will kick things off and explore scaling products and product teams globally. Then we'll have Sam Legg, product manager at Google, run through product road mapping for your startup. Finally, we'll have Kirupa Chinnathamby discuss how to successfully build and manage your product on Firebase. From there, we'll change gears and kick off a live stream panel and Q&A with our speakers and startup founders. The live panel will start right after the lightning talks end, so don't go anywhere. And get your questions ready. Feel free to post questions that you'd like our experts to answer in the chat throughout today's content. And as always, if you have any questions or comments for us, email us at founder-fridays@google.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to Drew to get us started. Over to you, Drew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Drew Bradstock, product director responsible for Google Kubernetes engine. Now, I'm fortunate enough to have an opportunity to talk about scaling global products as well as scaling global product teams. A little bit about myself. Previous to my current role, I worked on DoubleClick Ad Exchange at Google. When I joined, it was a small number of people. We were fortunate enough to be part of an experience to grow it into a multi-billion-dollar product that did span the globe. Right now, I am responsible for Google Kubernetes, and this is really unique because not only has it grown a lot internal to Google, we have a massive open source community that's gone from a small number of contributors to literally over 25,000. Obviously, those are not all Googlers, but it does really lead a lot of experience of what happens as you go through those different levels of change and scale. Traditionally, when startups, and many of you are leaders and founders of startups, you think of building out a platform. You start with something raw and new. You start adding support for new dev teams. And then you start adding the ability to handle workload scale and more applications and more teams, and then regional expansion. And then hopefully, and this is an obligatory Canadian reference, which I am, you've gotten that hockey stick growth and gone completely globally. Now, the challenge, though, is that as you really scale up and up and up your platform, your developer and team velocity goes down, and support and platform costs go up and up and up. And this really presents a lot of challenges. And almost every single level as you go through this is going to cause an inflection point in your company. Now, what enough people don't think about is how are you actually going to scale your company itself for success? So once again, rather than looking at the tech side of this, which you definitely have to think of both, you're going to start with just code it. It's the go for it. You've got the founding team. You start from there. You reach that point where it's, hey, we need more people and we need more teams. And then from there, suddenly a wild product manager appears. And this can actually cause a big fundamental change because it's gone from having a founding team to additional people who are responsible for the strategy. From there, and you're scaling just like your platform scales, you're going to start having multiple distinct teams. And from there, you're going to have different ways of doing things. And this can once again present that challenge because that original founding way of doing it, which very much matches one culture, suddenly becomes many different ways of doing things. And this can add friction. From there, and unfortunately, it's the P word, often companies like, oh, we need to regain control. Let's fix it with process. And this is often both bad and good because as you reach those different levels, just like on the tech side and engineering, you have to make sure there is a way to scale efficiently. But some teams go overly process heavy, especially depending who you got brought in to lead different parts of your organization. And that can really sour the culture you're running into. And I think once you've gotten through that, really that gate, and are looking at that global scale, companies reach an inflection point where either strategically you're going to be tops down and it can be, this is what we're doing and let's figure it from there. And there's many large corporations to do this. Or it's like, no, we want to retain the culture and go entirely bottoms up. Now, you're going to ebb and flow. Personally, we've gone through when it was very rigid and top down. Then we're like, wait, we've taken away agency from our teams. We need to change it. We need to bring it more bottoms up. So this is not a fixed thing, but the culture at the top and what you reinforce when you reach this scale is incredibly important. What I wanted to share is what's the experiences I've seen going through this. And I have made a ton of mistakes. Even now with Kubernetes, we continue to iterate all the time in terms of strategically how we're going to grow product and how we're going to grow the product itself. So a couple of lessons learned. And obligatory Canadian hockey stick as well. I had a giant hockey stick logo, but I figure we didn't actually write that photo, so I had to go with a fairly drab one. Number one, you're going to break multiple times. And if you're not breaking again and again and again and being honest of what's not working, you're really burying a lot of the problems you have. Great example of this is recently with Kubernetes, we've seen huge growth. It's been growing triple digits again and again and again. That's great. But unfortunately, our actual structure and the number of leaders we had to be able to handle this growth wasn't there. We had to get ahead of it and had to reevaluate how we're actually going to structure it and handle really decision-making globally. We'd left that for too long, and then suddenly we had to catch up. Same with how we handle the business. But it's each of those points, often people think of strategy, they don't think of who's actually going to implement it. And you've a scaled organization to be able to handle your growth, because good hiring, as you all know, can take 12 to 18 months for the right leader. And you shouldn't rush at these points. But if you're not planning for it, you're going to lag it and suddenly have to catch up when you really reach that pain point. So advice here is make sure you understand and are honest with yourselves and your fellow founders and leaders on what you think is going to break in the future, not just what's broken right now. Number two is that writing is incredibly powerful. I'm not saying I recommend the Amazon way where you silently read the docs beforehand, you slave away in an exact format. I don't think this is actually right for a lot of companies. That's a very rigid culture and a way of enforcing one view of doing things. That said, especially as you go through those transitions we talked about, having things written down is incredibly important as you go through each point. The reason for this is actually there could be slight discrepancies or big discrepancies, and without taking the time to write, and Google Docs is great for this because you can get tons of comments from a global team, you don't know if you're actually aligned. Really good example of this is myself and my co-eng lead for Kubernetes. He and I, when we do strategy, actually get together and then write two separate docs. Privately, same topic, how we view it, because we are really closely aligned. But it was amazing to see the slight differences that really mattered when we compared our two versions of the docs. Then when we worked external with the remaining org, we actually made sure it was folded into one, made a clean copy so you couldn't see all the arguments going on ahead of time. But that level of exposure and seeing the exact little details that did matter allowed us to understand where the friction points were. We're like, oh no, yeah, I'm saying the same thing, because often you're not. The second point, it's encouraging your staff and your teams across Eng and product and UX, design, the whole bit, to make sure they're writing as well, because it allows each of the layers to get aligned too. So we actually follow this. We have the strategy doc, we write as a small team, different versions, bring it together. And then within the pillars, because Kubernetes is pretty big, we're doing this as well. The other thing on the writing side, it makes sure you've got a record of what decisions are actually being made. And this is quite important. If it's done via email or side comments, that doesn't work. It also, you as a founder or you as a lead for your company, forces you to actually respond in writing so the decisions aren't made on a side Slack conversation or a late night coffee, but it really does bring a different rigor to you as a leader, and it gives your team the agency to actually push forward an idea, know a decision's being made that's not going to be undone. And lastly is don't assume you're aligned with your peers. I think the writing was a really good part of this, but the bigger you get, the more distinct views you're going to have from this. And that's going to create a lot of underlying friction. We've got internally within Kubernetes a view of how do we escalate things a lot faster when there is disagreements. I think escalation becomes a bad word for many of you. It feels it's going to be anger and, conflict. It doesn't have to be. But if you instead say, okay, we've got a difference that we can't resolve, write it together, figure out how to walk through it. And if you still can't get that alignment, bring it up quickly, but bring it up together. This has really helped scale our org as we started dealing with many different parts of Google, for instance, that may not have the same view. And even if you've got, say, a smaller startup at this point, this is something I think is incredibly important, because often a strong founder, people are afraid, unfortunately, to really give that key view. And then when you ask, oh, do you agree? People are like, yes. So take the time to figure out if you think there's misalignment, use the writing aspect and figure out how you actually stand, because that will avoid a lot of conflict later. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the time. Please do reach out if you've got any questions to this topic. My email is dbradzik@google.com. Would love to help all of you out.
Welcome, everyone. My name's Samuel Legg. I'm a product manager here at Google. In my past career, I've worked in many startups and on many startups. So today I wanted to talk to you all about building a useful roadmap for startups. This is a particular topic of mine that I'm passionate about. It's something that I feel like if you spend a lot of time getting this right, you'll reap a lot of rewards as a team in terms of how you build your product, how quickly you can build your product, and how much product you can release. So a quick TLDR before we jump in here. This is a longer session that I typically present to startup audiences, but for today's lightning talk, we're going to trim it down a bit. So the TLDR for today's session is roadmaps are important, but typical roadmaps are a waste of time for many startups. What I mean by this is the way that most people talk about road mapping is mostly geared towards businesses that are on the scale of Google, or at least a medium to large business. So we really want to talk today about what is a lightweight and highly flexible roadmap that is more built and ready for startups. And the main mentality to have here is basically time is a startup's most valuable resource. So we want to build roadmaps to make the best use of it. And there's kind of three main best practices that I typically talk about. For today, we're going to talk about the first one here, which is building a timeline based on task clarity. But just so that you understand, there's other tactics as well, including like shaping work effectively and using a process called bedding as part of your sprint planning process. And because I'm not going to cover all of it, I'd suggest that if you're interested in following up more on this type of topic and more on these best practices, there's an online resource called ShapeUp. Just Google ShapeUp. It's typically the first or second item on the list. It's a methodology built up by a team called Basecamp. And it's a very quick and actually enjoyable read about a new methodology mentality related to building great roadmaps. Okay, so let's dive in. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about the mentality that I like to think about when building roadmaps. So number one, each sprint is time you never get back. This seems, obviously quite intuitive, but it's an important mentality to think about as you're building out your product. And when it comes to time, this is basically in a startup, at least, as it is in many places, but in a startup, this is a little bit more critical than others. It's a function of the money that you have available to you as a business and the team and the size of that team and the cost of that team. So essentially the thought process here is if you increase the money that you have available to you, you increase the amount of time you have available to you as a business to work on things. In an opposite fashion, if you increase the size of your team, it typically reduces the amount of time you have available for your business to work on your product. So how this relates is basically time is a startup's most valuable resource. Everything that you do as a business leader, whether you're the co-founder or the CEO or individual contributor working inside the team, is thinking about how can you make best use of the time that your startup has available to it. So how I think about this is one of the best ways to make use of time, and the best ways to make sure that you can really manage the time that you have available to you best as possible is thinking about how you can build in flexibility and efficiency into your product dev processes. So making sure that you can change what you're working on easily. And when you are working on something, you're being as efficient as possible as a team and working on it. These two things really add up to a lot of gains across the board when you're working as a small team trying to ship a lot of product. So the question here then is, how can roadmaps help me save time? And there's kind of four main things I think about when I think about, why are roadmaps important at a startup. I know that many people are either in kind of two camps. One is, let's not waste any time on roadmaps. Those are useless. And other ones are like, if we don't build the perfect roadmap, we don't know what we're working on, so we can't get started. I think there's obviously a really happy medium between those two. And the way that I think about what that looks like is, number one, roadmaps really help provide transparency to your goals. So whether, again, you're a co-founder or you're a product manager in the team or the de facto product manager that doesn't have the title, this is a really great way to communicate to the whole team what you're working on and why you're working on it. Secondly, it's a really great tool for helping you organize the team around high impact work, making sure that every single sprint or every single cadence of whatever you're working on is always working on the most important thing. Full stop. That's what you want to do as much as possible. Roadmaps are your tool to do that. Number three, really, if you build these roadmaps well and collaboratively across your team, it's a great way to hold each other accountable. And this is more so from like a perspective of not just the teams at the lower level who are working on the product itself, but also the co-founders who are setting the goals and organizing when and what we're working on. Everyone gets to hold each other accountable when you have a clear and understandable roadmap. And number four, it acknowledges risks and uncertainties. I think this is one that a lot of people miss, but inside of a startup, when you don't know exactly who your customer is and you're still trying to figure out what market you're trying to enter, making sure that you are really upfront and honest about where your risks and uncertainties lie is a really great way to build trust and rapport with the team that you're working with. This is something that you constantly need to be building as you continue to grow out your team. So with those things in mind about like why roadmaps are important and the critical mentality around time being the most useful or the important thing for startups, let's talk a little bit about what a roadmap could look like for a startup. So number one, the goal here is, we want to build a lightweight roadmap that is focused on using your team's time as efficiently as possible. And so what that looks like from a requirement perspective is it's easy to understand. So anyone can look at this roadmap and very quickly understand what are the things that I'm likely going to be working on next. What are the things that are just after that? What do those things roughly entail? How big are they? Number two, it's really honest about accuracy or the lack thereof. This is something that I'm a really big proponent of, essentially making sure that there's no veil of secrecy around how accurate or how clear you are about what this task should or should not be. The more honest you can be about that accuracy, the better with your team. And number three, these roadmaps allow you to constantly reorganize around high impact work. And this is really getting into the flexibility aspect of road mapping and building. If you build a roadmap in the right way, you should be able to go in on Monday morning and basically reorganize everything that the team is working on in a half an hour. And everyone should be communicated pretty easily. Again, going to point A, they should be able to look at it, understand, hey, this is what's been reorganized and this is why. And this is all about just trying to make the best use of your time as a leader and the best use of your team's time so that they can build the best product they can build. So with that, I'm going to get into one of the best practices that'll kind of get you towards this North Star of a roadmap. But before I get into that, just one more shout out. The rest of these best practices and more are really built out of this online resource called ShapeUp. Again, Google it, easy to find, really easy to read through as well, free. So there's no real barrier for you to just take a couple hours and take a look through here and learn what you can. So best practices. Three things that you talk about. We're going to talk about the first one here today. So that's building a timeline based on clarity. So when we're thinking about building road mapping timelines, we're always thinking about development efficiency. And when I think about development efficiency, I think about two main variables or factors that contribute to being as efficient as possible. Number one is the clarity of a task. So this is really, when I create this task and I craft it for the team, how clear is it? And clarity is in the form of, how well do we know the customer? How well do we know what we need to build in order to address the customer's needs? How well do we know the problem? How well do we know the technology that we're going to use in order to deliver the solution? So really like a full picture of how clear this task is. And number two is the scope of the task. So yes, we might have a very clear task that has got a very clear understanding of the customer, the problem, the solution, but it's a really large task or it's a really small task. And these two factors are the biggest contributors to how efficient your team will be in building out product. So clarity of task, this is something that is typically in a large organization that has dedicated product managers like myself. This is the ideal function of a product manager, is to increase the clarity of a task before it gets to the team that needs to work on it. And so I always ask the teams that I work with, like, who is your de facto product manager for each task that you have in your roadmap? How can they spend more time creating clarity for the team before the team starts working on it? If there is no product manager, it's probably a combination of the co-founders, or maybe there's an engineer on the team who's contributing to the roadmap. Whoever it is, think about how you can stress the importance of creating as clear as ask as possible for the task as it's that's in the roadmap. The scope of the task, this is just a general rule, and I'm sure many people here are aware of this, but it's something that throughout my career has time and time again proven to be true. Essentially, the bigger the task, the larger the risk of not shipping. We've many times we've always said it's going to be different this time, even though this task is a big task. We think it's going to be different for X, Y, and Z, and it's not going to be overly risky in order for us to work on it. Very rarely is that true. And the reason why this is important to kind of remind ourselves is that, shipping more means learning more. Therefore, as much as possible, you should really try to roadmap small shippable tasks. I think additionally, I'd add one more thing there, which is, reliably shipping. So shipping on the schedule that you set out for yourself. Is also super important for the morale of your team. It makes people feel successful. It makes people feel like you're gaining momentum. And again, this is all related to how big these tasks are that you hand off to the team. There's a little asterisk there that says, sometimes shipping too much, too fast means you aren't spending time to learn. So I just always like to, remind teams that you can't work on, 5 features in a week, because then you're not spending time learning. So that's obviously a balance here, but typically the balance for most teams is more in the camp of building or scoping too large of tasks versus too small of tasks. Okay, so talking about the timeline as a tool here that we want to discuss. This is a typical timeline view broken up into kind of 3 main time periods. So how this works is from left to right. You read this, left being what you currently are working on, right being the furthest out amount of work that you've roadmapped. For the visualization here, we're kind of just using the size of these blocks to represent the scope of the task. So let's say, let's look at this map a little bit closer. Essentially, how this works and why it's shaped the way it's shaped is basically you should be able to, as you gain clarity in these tasks, you'll see that the smaller the task is, which is basically the scope of the task, right? The closer it is to the current sprint. And this is just a mental model for you to use when you're thinking about your timeline, is that, the roadmap should roughly reflect this at most times, where smaller tasks are closer to the current sprint, whereas larger unscoped tasks are further out in your timeline. And this is really what I'm talking about when it comes to like the clarity of a task guiding where it sits on the roadmap. When you have a task that is unclear and not fully ready for the team to pick up, it's okay to not work on it right away, right? We can put it a little bit further back in the roadmap and work on creating some more clarity before we bring it to the team. And just a quick note about the timelines here. So we're talking about 4 to 6 weeks, so a month and a half away from the current sprint, 2 to 3 months, so roughly a quarter, then 6 months out. I think many of us would know this already, but trying to plan more than 6 months out is typically a waste of time, especially in a startup. I would say when you're thinking about road mapping beyond this point, as much as possible, lean on your mission, lean on your vision to help your team understand what's going to be after those 6 months. And so let's just take a run through on like how this timeline approach would work in a practical example. So let's say that you have 2 new exciting tasks. Number 1 is a high value usability tweak. So this is something that, maybe you've watched someone use the product and they really are struggling at this specific point in the flow. And the second feature is a new feature idea. So this is a brand new feature that you want to add to the product. It's something that you've discovered by either understanding a problem set that the customer has and designing a solution for it. And so the question you ask yourself is, okay, I come in Monday morning and I got these 2 things that I want to add to the roadmap. How should these fit into the current schedule? So if we take that timeline view that we were just looking at, this is how I would suggest kind of mapping those out by default. Obviously, this is not how you should always map it. This is just a suggestion on how I would approach it based on the information that we have. So that high value usability tweak, it's probably something that is very clearly understood from the get-go because you've understood, hey, I know where the problem is. I've seen it firsthand. And I know that if we change the button or if we move this menu here, we'll solve that problem pretty quickly. So probably pretty easy to slot into this idea of like 95% clarity, which is that 4 to 6 week time frame. The new feature idea, you're coming in on Monday morning, you're super excited about this new feature and you want the team to work on it. I'd suggest as a starting point, put it into that 2 to 3 month bucket and really working on figuring out how to create more clarity in order to get it into that next 4 to 6 week bucket. This is something that I've seen personally being a product manager inside of a high growth startup. People that run these businesses, they're super excited about the product that we're working on. Many times the executives on the team have a really great idea coming on Monday morning that they want to see in the product as quickly as possible. Putting that feature right in the immediate next sprint without spending the time to really distill and break down exactly what we want out of that feature really is just leading your team to disaster in some ways because you're basically handing them off an unclear task that is not probably fully scoped. And you're going to completely break down their efficiency in delivering product for you. So I'd suggest, generally high level reminder, think about clarity when you're road mapping items. Just because you have something new and exciting doesn't mean it needs to be built tomorrow. Really optimize for efficiency of your team's development. And efficiency is highly impacted by the clarity of the task that you're handing off to the team and the scope of that task. And with that, that's kind of it for my session. Hopefully that was helpful, and I really appreciate you all listening.
Hi everybody, my name is Krupa. I'm a product manager at Firebase on Google. And in the vein of today's talk, which is really about scaling products, I'd like to talk to you about reaching 1 billion users with Firebase. And so if you don't know what Firebase is, it is Google's app development platform. Many developers, small, large, medium-sized, tend to build a variety of apps using Firebase. We have about 3 million in-market apps over the past 28 days. Some of the names you might see here are probably very familiar to you. They span games, they span mobile apps, web apps, the whole range of applications you might think. Firebase plays a pretty critical role. And the type of apps you might see fall into phone, desktops, laptops, also larger screen devices like TV. So really small screens like your phones and new emerging technologies like augmented reality, mixed reality, virtual reality. All these areas that you might be building your apps in, Firebase plays a pretty crucial role in helping make development possible because our mission is this. We want to help developers succeed by making it easy to build and operate apps. And we really want to overemphasize the word easy because many of you have a billion things you're doing as part of running your startups, running your businesses. And app development should be one that is as least complicated as possible for you. And so if we take a step back and look at the architecture, how a typical app is built, there's a part that runs on your device, on your phone, your tablet, or any of the other form factors looked at that you interact with and see. And then the capabilities of your app oftentimes rely on a server, something running remotely. You might have something like authentication, or you might have some complicated activity that requires a lot of computation that you don't want to do locally. So you delegate that to some machine somewhere else. And so Firebase plays a pretty crucial role across all stages of your application, whether it's running on the local device or whether it's relying on something running remotely on a computer hundreds of thousands of miles away. But for today, I want to focus on this part. I want to focus on the server side because it's often an underappreciated part of what it takes to scale an application that gets a lot of users very, very quickly. Now, when we think about servers, we've had them for a very long time. This whole idea of a remote computer on the internet doing something on our behalf or on our app's behalf, it's been around for a very, very long time. For example, here's an example of an early server or server setup from almost 70 years ago, where you have machines that are doing some computation and you have the consumption of it being somewhere else. We're not quite, there today. Today we've gone much further. We have more specialized activities that rely on servers on a regular basis. And here are a handful of examples. If you browse the internet, if you use the web to go from page to page, a web server is playing a role. Or if you send an email, there's an email server or an app server. If you're storing any data, like let's say you take a photo on your phone and then that photo is synced somewhere for everyone to access, there's a storage device and really massive computational storage bucket that handles all the data. Or you have databases, or if you're logging in, authentication. All these things rely on servers in some form or fashion. Now, when we think about servers, there are really two approaches that we typically work in. One is managed servers, and this is where we handle all things related to it. And then there's a world of serverless, where we don't worry about servers at all, but we just write code and everything gets taken care of for us. I'm going to briefly talk about both of these areas because many of you might be in one of these two buckets, and it's worth looking into where the pros and cons are. So when we talk about managed servers, it's really this. This is the more traditional view of servers. It's the most popular way that all of your application tends to communicate with a backend service, and you basically pay a server provider a monthly fee, and you get access to your very own computer with your own name on it that runs 24/7, and we're responsible for its entire operation. And when we think of a managed server, you might think of visuals of really complicated labs with a lot of wires and very complicated activities that a human being has to perform to keep everything up and running. That is true. There's a part of it there, but luckily we've gotten to the point where everything is pretty much nicely abstracted away. So you can essentially, if you want a server, you get to specify how it's going to look, what capabilities it's going to have, and what kind of software it's going to be running on top of it. And then the way you manage it is not by walking over to a data center, but by having a nice dashboard where you can point and click and configure the various things your server does. But because the server is your own, you do have the ability to almost virtually connect a keyboard to the physical device and own all aspects of it. You have a terminal, you have full access to everything that is going on in your server. So you do have that capability as well. Now, when it comes to managed servers, though, there are some rough edges, some things that if we had to start over today, we may do differently in how we build them. The first one is pricing. With a managed server, you pay a flat fee, and this covers time that your server is actually doing things, but it also covers this probably a long period of time where it's not always doing things. If we look at a typical usage of a server, there's going to be spikes in activity. There will be times when people are waking up, they're using your app a lot, or when they're about to call it a day, they're using your app a lot. But there's a large period of time where there isn't a whole lot of activity going on. But as with how pricing works, you're going to be paying for times that are really not worth paying for because your server isn't doing anything. The second one is scalability, because your server has a fixed amount of resources, and you kind of specify up front how much hard drive space, how much memory, how many CPUs is going to be involved. So if your server gets a lot of requests, the first handful that are within capacity will work. But then if you have users who are using it that go beyond what the server can handle, you'll get a very pleasant message. The server will suddenly tell you that, sorry, it can't really help out. You might have seen this error directly, a 429 error where it says a server is telling you that, please try again, or your application might interpret this and give you a nice message instead. And the other part of managed servers is that they're often single region. Your audience might be worldwide, but your server might geographically be in a single location. And typically, the closer you are to the server, the faster your access will be. So in this case, users who are very close to where your server is will have a much better user experience when compared to users who are geographically really far away. They will just have some difficulties. And of course, when we talk about managed servers, the key word is manage. We're managing it. We're making sure everything works. And if something doesn't work, it falls on us to allocate some time and fix it. Here's an example of me running into an issue where I caused a database outage, and basically it falls on me as well to go through and make sure that this gets fixed. So, not exactly the best use of time, especially if you have other things to do. Now, to contrast this world where we take care of the servers, you have the world of serverless, where we don't really worry about servers at all. Now, the word serverless is a kind of an odd choice because it doesn't mean there's no server involved. There's still a physical server, and there's still all the work involved that needs to take place. But the difference is that it's not you or I is going to be dealing with that. We bypass this whole set of activities around provisioning and configuring servers and jump straight to working on application, writing code, enabling service, the things that are really the ones what we want to focus on because we have many things that we need to do. There are a bunch of serverless providers that you might be familiar with. Google Cloud is a very popular one. You have Azure, you have AWS, you have Cloudflare, and of course, Firebase, and which is one we're going to talk about more later. But the idea behind serverless is that you spend more time doing this. You spend more time building your app, writing your code, doing the things that you really want to do. And then deployment is also handled automatically for you. You just say, I'm done with my code, do it, and ship it. And then the capabilities behind the scenes takes care of all the complexities typically involved with getting something to work in your browser, giving an API, and so on. And so let's talk about the various aspects of serverless and how that might benefit us as we're thinking about scaling. So let's start with pricing. Because computing resources in a serverless world, they're brought online on an as-needed basis. There's no dedicated server running 24/7 that needs to be there. So we typically pay for usage, not necessarily just time a server has been going. So earlier we saw about how we were paying for a day's worth of usage, even though the server was only doing work in certain spikes. In the serverless world, the payment is typically on a per user basis. So here you can see an example where I'm paying for exactly the amount of time my server is doing specific work. So it's not really time, but it's more activity. Second, scalability, because a server needs to be available to process requests. In a serverless world, that processing, that provisioning is handled automatically for you. So the number of requests you have determines how many servers are brought online to make this work. And this is all done automatically without us having to do anything. So if you have a very moderate set of requests, you might just see your server handling it really well. But then if you have a lot of requests, the number of servers grows, in accordance with the number of requests automatically. So more servers are brought in, users are happy, no need for you and I to do any kind of configuring. Second part is closer to devices, because serverless doesn't mean that you have a physical server. Your server can be brought online anywhere geographically your users are, which means that just before when we had a server that was great for people close by, not so great for people further away, in a serverless world, you can bring up a server very quickly in real time to where the close users are, which means that they get a really good user experience, which is always good. So really, if I had to summarize the world of serverless in like a sentence, is really focus on code and services and scale from a handful of users to 1 billion times that number of users without any extra effort on your end. Serverless takes care of all of that for you. And Firebase plays a critical role here because our entire solution is really based on serverless and simplifying all the various tasks involved here. Not to get into too much detail here, but you can imagine if you have an application with an architecture that requires, let's say in this case, like text recognition, all the various pieces that you need to think about in terms of building your app and making sure the services to handle all this really effectively are handled. Firebase provides you with something that does this really well. And we have a lot of case studies, but I'll talk about my favorite one, which is Sworkit, which is really, you have 3 developers. They have a complicated problem of making a video streaming platform, and it needs to scale as video is pretty CPU intensive. And Firebase gives you all the various things needed, where 3 developers were able to scale to serve 10 million users by just using the various components and our great documentation needed to make this work. So you might be wondering, how do we get started? Well, Firebase gives you everything from the easily to the build step, to the deploy step, to the test step for mobile and web apps. So go to firebase.google.com to learn more about how it can help you out. And with that, if you have any questions, I'm always up for discussing any aspect of this. You can email me, you can find me on Twitter, or you can contact me via my blog. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our presenters for those lightning talks. For those who are just joining us now, my name is Ashley Francisco, and I lead Google's startup ecosystem efforts across Canada. And I'm thrilled to be hosting Founder Fridays this month. A huge thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Before we start the panel, just a few logistics. We'll kick off by meeting our speakers and starting off with a few questions that I have for them. From there, we will prioritize audience questions. So please do share your questions with us using the Ask a Question button below the video. And don't forget to hop in the chat and tell us your startup and where you're tuning in from. All resources, including the live presentations and this Q&A, will be made available early next week. And if you have any questions for us at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to founder-fridays@google.com. We're also very excited to let you know about an opportunity for our Founder Fridays participants to receive mentorship office hours with our Google experts. For this month, we're offering one-on-one sessions with our product management experts for up to 10 founders. Spaces are limited, so apply through the form linked in the chat. And if you've been selected, you'll hear from us to set up some mentorship sessions in the month of June. Now that we have those details out of the way, up next is our live stream panel and Q&A. And we'll be joined by all 3 of the speakers you just heard from, Drew, Sam, and Karupa. And we also have Ingrid Polini, co-founder and CEO of Safety Docs Global, and one of our amazing Google for Startups Accelerator alumni. All right, let's dive in. I'd love to hear from each of our speakers in their own words to do some introductions. And let's start with you, Ingrid.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ingrid Polini. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Safety Docs. And it's amazing to be here. Welcome.
Thank you. Drew, I'll hand it over to you next.
Hi, everyone. I realize I probably should have coordinated my shirt with the previous recording, but my bad. So Drew Bradstock, I run Kubernetes for Google, based up in Toronto, Canada, and really looking forward to the questions. Thanks for everyone's time.
Thank you. And Sam, over to you.
Hey everyone, Sam here. I'm a product manager in the Google AR team, currently working out of the Waterloo office. Super excited to be here.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Karupa.
Hi, everybody. My name is Karupa. I'm a product manager on Firebase, and I love scaling products through serverless. So looking forward to chatting with all of you.
Awesome. Well, then I guess we have you for the perfect event. So thank you so much for joining us. Okay, I'm going to start with a question that would apply, I'm sure, to all of you. And we heard some similar questions already from the audience. But what advice would you have for an earlier stage startup founder just starting to build out their product? What are the things to think of in the early days as you're kind of kicking off? Sam, knowing you have direct startup experience, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say on this topic. So I think maybe going back to my lightning talk, I'd say like one of the biggest things I suggest to founders, and something that we talk about a lot when we go into the mentorship sessions, is about how do we create focus for the team. So I know that there's a lot of opportunities typically in front of startups. It's always exciting to come in on a Monday morning and if there's a greenfield opportunity in front of you and you want to do this, that, and the other for, all these different types of customers. But as a leader and, founders or, de facto product managers inside of your teams, the greatest thing you can do to really, increase the morale of the team, increase their ability to feel like they're actually accomplishing something and learning from their customers is to, where you can, create focus, whether it's in your roadmap, whether it's in your team meetings, or whether it's in generally just about, how you drive conversations and priorities across the organization.
Awesome. Thank you. And Ingrid, maybe I'll hand it over to you next. You're certainly in the scaling phase, but it wasn't too long ago that you were kind of just up and running. So what insights can you share?
I second what Sam said. And also, I think that as startup founders, we get super exciting about new ideas. And sometimes we scatter our focus and trying to do everything at once. So I'd say that really focusing in what are the next steps and organizing the next steps, especially for production and testing. And the second thing I will say is be very careful with the tech stack and be very careful to make sure that your software is being made for scale, because otherwise you might get 3 or 4 years later and have to revamp the whole software because you didn't think about it on the start. So really taking care of those things that seems that not so exciting, that really, really makes a difference when you're thinking about ramping up and scaling the product.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Drew and Krupa, I'm sure both of you can attest to Ingrid's comment there. Anything that you want to add?
I think be really picky with the first PM you pick up, right? The PMs help scale founders, right? It takes a lot of the work off, but that first person you pick up or the first couple really set the cultural tone. So don't settle. I made a mistake in the past where I was just underwater, so hired someone and I shouldn't have. It ended up being far more work and had to unwind it. So be choosy, but don't wait. Like prioritize the hiring a PM early. It takes a lot of work off and allows you to scale what you do for the business.
Krupa, what other insights can you share for our early stage founders on the line?
Absolutely. And to add to all the great information already shared, definitely, build often and ship to your customers frequently to make sure you're building the right thing. It's often very easy to get caught up on cool technology or a cool idea that may be floating on your head, but it may not be the biggest problem your customers are having. So the whole idea of product market fit, which we hear a lot about, it's something that is a difficult area. And one of the ways you can kind of make that simpler is by finding a handful of customers, working with them very closely, and just airing your product based on their feedback.
Awesome. Thank you. And Drew, I feel like you teed me up for the next question that I wanted to ask. So let's probe a little bit deeper into the comment you just made. But many of the founders and startup leaders on the call today are in that growth phase and probably thinking about when do I need to hire a product lead? And not only when, but who should I be looking for and what are the traits that I should be looking for? So Drew, I'll start with you and then we'll do a roundtable.
Yeah, I'm going to give counter advice. I'm super curious in Ingrid's view on it. I think if you hire yourself, you've made a big mistake. Like often the first PM is identical. It's the same personality. Like it's a really good fit. And what you actually want early on is someone that complements your strengths and weaknesses. If you are just all ideas, all iteration, get someone who's a little more operationally focused because they will very much be your right hand. And same with engineering, where I'd be looking at that of actually what holes they fill skill-wise, not just tech-wise, and have that because that does allow you to scale. If you just get an identical copy of yourself, you can, you bring up the best of you, but it also amplifies the worst of you too. So not enough people do that. They just look for mini clones of themselves and the same passion and same views. You want to get some disagreement to keep you honest and help and stabilize too.
I love that. A challenger perspective, perhaps, to bring to the table.
Very much so. Not someone who's going to disagree with everything, but you want someone who's going to be able to say, like, hey, we should speed up or slow down and be able to do some checks and balances early because it's such a good culture for how your company is going to operate too.
Ingrid, I think Drew wanted to hear your thoughts. We all agree. So what can you add to that?
I second what Drew said, and I think it's very important as a founder, just in general, when you're doing hiring, considering your deficits in certain areas and how people that you're hiring can complement you. Because sometimes, because the process in startups is so fast, like, oh, you have to hire someone here, we sometimes don't really get the time to know and notice, like, okay, I'm not that good at planning this, so I might hire someone that has more of those characteristics. And as hard as it can be as a founder, having that sounding board where people can challenge your ideas and your views is super important. In terms of product management, I do think it's important to consider people that actually worked at startups or have experience in startups. The work can be very different. Sometimes product managers that come from very large companies or non-tech companies want to work in startups, but they don't have they can't give the support to the founders that the founders need with the expertise. So you need people that are experts on the start, so it actually can offload from you and not add more. So you have to actually teach the person.
Thank you. And Karupa, I'm sure you've hired a bunch of PMs in your time. Anything when you're actually kind of sitting down and interviewing qualities that you're looking for, things that are green lights or red flags to you?
Yeah, definitely, +1 to what Ingrid and also Drew mentioned about you want to hire someone who balances it out. I look at, a lot of these early stages, it's like you're building a table and you want to have all the legs be, able to support you. And if you, over-index on any one area, typically trying to hire yourself, you create something that's not very stable. And so definitely that's one of the big ones. And the other ones are just oftentimes just fundamentals. Do they have the basic skills of product management? Are they customer focused? Are they willing to be open to be challenged with new ideas? Can they get things done? Just the basic areas. And then passion is another angle. It's like, how are they excited about this space? And is it something that they would be willing to, figure out creative ways of unblocking themselves, unblocking the team? And those are things that are also worth looking into.
Thank you for that. And Sam, you've gone through a journey of one of the first PMs at a startup that grew and scaled itself, and then now within the Google family. Is it different what you look for in a PM team member in a company that has successfully scaled versus kind of the first 1 or 2 PMs you're trying to secure?
Yeah, I think there's one thing that's quite different, I'd say, in terms of like what you might look for at a place like Google for an early product management hire on a project versus your first product manager hire in a business. I'd say like the big difference for me is if you have like the opportunity to pick between someone who is like a jack of all trades of sorts versus like a specialist, I'd say like you probably want to lean a little bit more towards the jack of all trades. There's just so much diversity in terms of the role that a product manager will have to like carry in a small business that you want someone who kind of like lean and juke and jive depending on where the business is going. And sometimes specialists can struggle with that if they can't play to their strengths. So that's one thing. And as you grow, you probably want to change and move that lever a little bit more towards the specialist. And the second thing is something that like we thought about a lot when my previous company was working with someone who's a really good teammate at a startup. So one of the questions that we asked is it's a goofy question for us because we like camping, but maybe finding your own version of it. But essentially asking the question like, would I be able to go on like a weekend-long camping trip with this person? The real reason why we asked that question is like, the growth phase of a startup is hard. You're going to go through a lot of ups and downs. And so you really want to make sure that those product managers as a founder are someone who you can like, work side by side with, but also like, they can turn around and work side by side with other people on your team. Being a glue as a function as product management, but also just being a glue as a team member and a leader, honestly, within a business is a really strong skill if you can find that in an early product manager hire.
Thank you for that. I love that analogy. You want to make sure if the tent leaks that, that you can still enjoy the weekend together.
Exactly.
And that hygiene's good, right? You're going to be in a small space with these people for a long period of time. So there's that angle as well.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Sam, I'm going to stay on you. We've got an audience question from Greg, and he'd love your thoughts on how to help avoid the trap where startup leaders focus too much on roadmaps and isolation, i.e. here's our roadmap, let's update the roadmap, and focus on that too much instead of getting out into the real world, validating user, customer, buyer needs and demands. So how do you think about striking that balance there?
Yeah, I think I just refer back to the lightning talk a little bit in answering that question. I think the one thing that I would say, the reason why that methodology to me is so important is essentially because roadmaps are really important across the team. And one thing that founders will do frequently is say, like, again, if we don't have a clear roadmap, like I don't understand what we're building, like why don't we have a roadmap out to 6 to 12 months out? I'd say as a product leader or whoever is kind of playing that role within the business. Making a roadmap that's flexible and like is really lightweight is going to kind of ease the burden of communicating, hey, to the leads, like this is kind of what we're building roughly. But as we get closer to when we actually are going to build it, we'll give you more clarity and allow you to weigh in and actually scope the work. But not setting the expectation that we're going to provide ultimate clarity 6 months out at all times, and then moving those boxes around at all times too, depending on what happens within the business. It's just too much effort, I find, at least for myself, to manage that, and you end up spending more time managing a roadmap and communicating the roadmap than you do actually building product and talking to customers. So yeah, kind of easing that burden as much as possible through like building like a flexible, lightweight roadmap. And then maybe if you're having struggles with that in your team, maybe you need to have a session with the people who are representative of those stakeholders who would weigh in on this roadmap, and get them to buy in to that approach, right? Say like, hey, this is why we want to do what we want to do in terms of building this new approach to the roadmap. And these are the reasons why. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you. And Ingrid, I'd love your thoughts on this one also, being kind of a user of a roadmap and a startup. How do you think about making sure that the roadmap is adding value to the team and not just becoming kind of like a process in the way?
I think it's important to reframe the roadmap, where we have the roadmap of the big ideas, again, as Sam mentioned on his pre-recorded presentation, but actually on the day-to-day, making it clear what the team will be working on. And I think in terms of making sure that you're listening to the users, right? There's a balance there. So for example, at Safety Docs, what we do is that whenever a user sends an idea, we put in a populated pool that we kind of add. And then if there's too many users that are asking for a specific feature, we then implement it. And then we can work with that, but also making sure that we are hitting the roadmap for the long run of like the big ideas that we have for the business. I think the roadmap is super important to make sure that the team feels like they're going somewhere, and the engineering team feels like they're going somewhere and they're finishing what they're starting. And at the same time, adding those features that might be important for the user, because I've seen startups spend like 3, 4, 5 weeks in something that the clients didn't even use, right?
Definitely. Thank you for that. Karupa, we're getting some questions from the audience on pricing. One specific for you was, how did you and the team ideate and ultimately decide on the right business model and revenue model that you applied? So it could be, for Firebase or any of your experiences, but how do you think about that kind of in the early days when you're thinking about going to market?
Yeah, it's a complicated area. There's lots written about it, but one of the easier ways is just to identify, with the customers you have, what is their willingness to pay for something? There are many ways of looking at it in terms of, are you solving an existing problem for them? And is that a problem you're saving in terms of time or cost? And what is the right price you can pay or charge where someone's willing to use that? And so that's one approach you can take. But in terms of let's take a product like Firebase, the model we typically follow is one where you have a freemium model where you start with generous quotas, you get to evaluate, I always look at what's the 5-minute experience going to be like? How can we make it very easy for someone to, onboard, learn about your product and feel convinced that this is worth their time to dive deeper into? And what can we do to remove all that friction? And that could often mean that in some cases it's free, in some cases it's free with some caveats, or there's a price point that you're willing to pay because some customers may feel more comfortable actually paying for something as opposed to not paying for something. And so it depends, and it's more situational, but your customers are the best indicators on what the right answer is, of course.
Agreed. And Drew, I'd love your builds on this too. I know you've got experience in a lot of kind of first to market product areas. And so how do you think about approaching pricing models and going to market in those worlds?
It's tough. I think chatting with your customers as much as possible. Don't just index to your competition, right? It's pricing by value. But the key thing is you can never raise prices, right? The model of cloud and SaaS is it's very difficult to do it. I did it with Kubernetes. I had hate mail for a month and was called the VP of bad decisions for all of cloud. And I still have that tweet saved, but it's really tough to do it because the expectation is there and it calls out a whole bunch of issues. So it's actually, when you're really early on, it's better to have a higher price and discount down. You're going to buy your first customers. Like the last startup I worked at, CEO is great at this. and actually bought his way into some really massive clients, but then it was based on discounting, not list. So go in higher end list and then use your experience, your sales team, yourself to figure out what that natural price point is. The other thing is you got to be careful you don't buy yourself into bankruptcy and your burn rate is too high. These days, things are a lot tighter. So you have to be looking at actually much heavier focus on cash flow. So you can only buy so many accounts before being negative on all the deals is not sustainable. And that's a real issue these days with just getting the next round of financing.
Thank you for that. I'm sure now you're going to have a lot of folks trying to find that tweet that you referenced.
Corey Quinn, it's like, I remember telling my wife, like, today's not good. It made Hacker News #1.
Oh, no.
Which you never want to be. For the record, like, you'd never want to be that high up. It does not go well. And I stand by the decision, but yeah, it was bad.
Well, the benefit is our audience members can learn from your experience.
Yes, Hacker News is bad when you're on it. That's all I can say, right? It's very rare that it's good news.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we have a question that I think all of you would be equipped to answer. And so Mariana is asking, what are some best practices for staying close to customer needs to gain certainty on the vision you have for your product and gain confidence, especially in more of those greenfield kind of blue sky initiatives? So, you know, whether it's quarterly brainstorms with customers, shadowing and interviewing customers, whatever tools do you all have in your toolkit in that scenario? And so maybe I'll start with Ingrid, thinking back to the days when you were ideating what Safety Docs could be, what it should be. How did you make sure that you weren't building in isolation and that you were building for the end user?
I think that shipping and testing with the customer as fast as you can in a safe manner is very important, because when you work with the customer hand by hand in hearing the feedback, which sometimes is hard. I remember that we spent weeks building this beautiful report that 3 of the customers that were testing said, like, we don't use this. And I was like, okay, great. Like, this doesn't go anywhere anymore. So really being very open to feedback from the users, but working with them as often as you can, especially for shipping big ideas. So like a report or some kind of like new feature that you already know if it's going to work or not, even if it's on the MVP page. So they might not be able to add information or fully use it, but if they can already test it and tell you, and at least my experience with my customers, that they really feel appreciated when their feedback is listened to. And we say, like, maybe we can do this now, or maybe we can do this later, and work with them in that regard.
Thank you. And Sam, I know some of your experience involved products that you actually didn't even want in the user's hands yet. And so how did you and the team kind of balance making sure that you were steering in the right direction, but also kind of keeping things as behind the scenes as you needed to for those moments in time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a couple things I could say on this. Like, number one is like, there's a general methodology that I'm sure many people are aware of, but human-centered design, I think it's always good to kind of go every year and remind yourself, you know, what that means and the processes that are involved there, and how you can use like different techniques to kind of keep yourself human-centered whenever you're doing brainstorming or product thinking or workshopping with, whether it's your customers or with your team. That's just one call out, like go back, review that, see what tools might be relevant to you. The second thing is like thinking about research and how you use research within your organization. Like, to be completely frank, like, you know, doing research well is actually very hard. Like at Google, we have large functions specifically focused on research, and you know, these people are extremely talented researchers and spend, you know, full-time, multiple of them on projects that can span in some cases months. So just keeping that in the back of your head that like doing good research is hard. There's kind of 2 main things that you want to think about as a founder in these early stage startups. So like, are you trying to do, you know, foundational research? So is this research that is going to guide the overall vision and product features of what you're shipping and working towards? That's, you know, one bucket of research that requires, you know, one set of or a different set of processes than from evaluative, which is research that is being done on your current product or prototypes of your current product, where you're actually like handing it to customers or watching what they're doing while they're using your product and tweaking it and making it different depending on what they need and what they want. And the reason why these 2 things are important to understand that they're different and separate is that you kind of use them to guide your product in different ways. So on the evaluative side, you're going to only be able to evaluate what you give your customers, right? So they're never going to probably be able to give you ideas outside of that sandbox. Whereas foundational is going to give you, A, naturally how people will likely think about your product, regardless of whether or not your product is in front of them, and B, give you an idea of how they think about your product, and in a natural way that will help you guide your current product towards it, or at least identify the areas that you have risks essentially in your product that you can, at some point, either like fix, solve, address, or just acknowledge as a business and keep charting your path forward.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to pivot to another audience question from Matthew. And Karupa, I'm going to start with you for this one. Matthew asks, do you have a favorite method of getting new product feature traction with existing users when rolling out a new feature? And he even references his own behavior and says when he uses products, sometimes he never gets around to trying out the new feature because he's more comfortable with the existing ones. And so, on a platform like Firebase, I'm sure this happens all the time with new features being rolled out. So how do you help ensure that your users are getting the most out of everything you're shipping?
Absolutely. And with Firebase, it's interesting because we do release new features, but we also want to minimize disruption for existing customers. So we always try to make sure that we balance the needs of having cool, new, shiny things that we are absolutely certain will solve real problems for you, but we don't want to make it a forcing function for you to have to abandon what you're doing or do some extra work to then have to make a migration to something new. And depending on your business and what your product is doing, you'll have to balance those things out. But in general, there are several parts to it. One is, am I building the right thing? That's one angle. I think we've talked a lot about it in the panel so far. The other angle is, once I built something, how do I let people know that I actually built it? And this goes back into how customer-centric in many ways you are and what kind of feedback your customers appreciate getting. If you happen to have a very loyal fan base, someone who, an audience that really likes what you're doing, you probably have many mechanisms. Could be an email, could be a newsletter, could be social media. You have many ways of being able to explain to people, hey, we have something cool, please check it out, give us feedback. In more traditional sectors, you may not have that kind of a luxury. You might be several layers removed from the person who might be using the feature and the person who is making a decision on whether this feature should be used, and their mechanisms for being able to go through that. You may have a sales team, you might have an account management team, you might have the right people in your organization who will have that right approach of making the message go across. And so it's a little bit of a choose your adventure and understand your customers to figure out what is the best mechanism that they would appreciate, because you don't want to be spamming, essentially, to go to one extreme. We also don't want to be a silo where you just assume that by you building it, people will automatically find it. For the most part, that doesn't work either. So there's a balance somewhere in the middle, and only your customers can tell you exactly what they prefer.
Thank you so much for that. Drew, I know you have to leave us in about 5 minutes to share your insights at another event. So I want to get to one last question for you.
Can I ask one just quick answer on the other one?
Yeah.
I'm super jaded on this. I've been doing this a long time. The videos hide all the gray hair, which is kind of nice. I've appreciated being at home. No one's going to read your release notes. And especially as your product gets bigger, if you're not really obvious about what's new, no one's going to find it, right? Like, your users are overwhelmed. No matter what you're doing, they're not going to find it. They're never going to know what you know. So over-index if it's important. Have catch-up bars, the warning bars, whatever the alerts, and they make it really easy to play. We've found within Kubernetes that guided, hey, click on and here's how you can do a live demo, and here's how it connects directly in. If you want them to use it, spend way more time on making it easy for them to play with it, try it, and use it right away. Otherwise, they don't. Like, marketing doesn't work in this regard. It tends to be sort of your own bubble. So you've got to make it really obvious to your users. Sorry, Ashley, I just thought I'm passionate about this one. I was arguing with my own team yesterday on it, so I thought I'd share.
No, thank you for that. It's not a shock to hear that folks aren't reading the fine print of new updates. So thank you for sharing that. Last question for you, Drew. As you think about kind of rolling out new features and products, how often should you think about checking in on success metrics, and how do you know if you are ultimately driving success for the team?
Yeah, we actually just changed this within Kubernetes. Like, when I say Kubernetes, it's not Kubernetes everything. This is Google, our offering for it. We actually now bake success metrics right into the PRDs and right in the plans, and Engine product do it together right from day one. Because if you don't have that, I found a lot with startups, it'll come later and then you just don't know. And it ends up being some bad proxy metric. So this really helps because then Eng knows what the goal is. It forces product to really think of what's the impact from this. So I'd say right from the very beginning and spend more time on measurement than you probably think you should, because otherwise you don't know if all that really valuable Eng time, especially a startup, is paying off. So super early, right from the beginning is key for me. It's a tough change. We didn't have it in my last startup. And then once we start measuring things, people are like, oh my goodness, here's who's actually using it, or here's the differences. And it fundamentally changed what we focus on with the next iteration. So thanks.
I love that. I think it's important to have the metrics right up front because it might unlock some key insights, i.e., oh, we don't know how to measure that today, and things that you also need to figure out as you're moving forward. So, Drew, I know you have to leave us now. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge and expertise with the group today. So thank you again. Okay, on to the next question for our speakers. Stephen is asking, and I'm sure you all have a great response to this, but let's start with Ingrid. In making transition to roadmaps, i.e. this team does not have a PM, what would be the first thing to get done? And maybe I'll just add, and who should ultimately be responsible for doing that if you don't have a PM in your org yet? So Ingrid, I'm sure you didn't have a product roadmap on day one at your startup. So what did that look like for you all as you were getting that off the ground?
I would say that when you don't have a PM, the founder is basically a PM, and you have to learn from the start. So you're basically a PM until you have someone to do that, and you're basically everything until you have someone to do that specific job, right? So in terms of product roadmap, I think it's important to map out what are the basic features that would bring the clients the most value, or the prospects the most value, that you can ship the faster, and we'll make that a complete platform. And then putting that on perspective. And then what are the ideas that you have that you can just put in a back burner in a document, in a Google Doc somewhere else, that you might get to at some point in the platform. When we first start, we want to do everything, right? And we want to do everything to the roadmap. It's like, oh yeah, we can work like 20-hour days. We're just going to ship everything at once. And that never works. And we never get up to doing it. So really making sure that you're putting the best features after doing interview with customers, after doing interview with users, that you can ship the faster to get the users testing. That would be the main. And then working the roadmap from there.
Thank you. Krupa, I saw you nodding when Ingrid was like, well, the founder is the PM. So anything you want to add to Ingrid's response?
No, that is essentially right. The product management role is often cross-cutting. There's no clear definition of today I'm going to be working on A, tomorrow I'll be working on B. And that naturally aligns with what founders typically have to deal with in a typical day, where their job is going to be changing based on what the day brings. And so I think there's a natural alignment between the founder having that visibility to be able to manipulate and work through all the various situations that basically come in on a typical day at work.
Thank you for that. Sam, anything to add on your side?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One thing is to have a roadmap. The next thing you need to have is a process to get the people into a cadence of building towards that roadmap. So I think in a startup, all of these things are obviously a lot more flexible and malleable than you would be in a more established business. So use that to your advantage as much as you can. One thing that we've done in the past, which I think is super helpful to help everyone on your team feel like they have input into the roadmap, is let's say you have a 4 or maybe a 6 week sprint cadence, or whatever your sprint cadence is. Figure out how to carve out some time in between sprints to allow the team to rest a little bit from the sprint, and basically give them free reign of that time to build what they want to build, or build what they think is important to build for the product itself. This is a couple different things that this can help with, but the major thing that it's most important for is really just energizing your team and making them feel part of the process, and allowing you to give them time to contribute their own ideas, but then saying, okay, once we're done with that, we're going back to the regular scheduled programming, which is the roadmap. So So two things: just making sure that you have a cadence and a structure to how you want to build up the roadmap, and number two is thinking about giving your team some time to freely contribute to the product itself in between sprints.
Thank you for reminding us about important words like rest and re-energize. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's so easy for teams that like startup land to get exhausted from building on such a tight schedule all the time, and it feels scary to give teams time to rest. But in my experience, giving them time to rest pays a lot of dividends that you wouldn't otherwise be able to quantify by just looking at the timeline and the calendar. So definitely encourage you to consider it if you think it's important.
Thank you. I appreciate that. A question that just came in that I was waiting for, to be honest. So Matthew asked, how do you handle one-off features that only a small group of companies or customers want, even if those customers won't commit without those features? So this is the classic PM debate of, stick to the roadmap or introduce something new because it's critical for some of our users. And so I'm sure you've all encountered this. Ingrid, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Krupa.
I'm thinking about that question a little bit. I think that it really depends. One thing that we do apply at Safety Docs is that if it's just a small group of users and they want that shipped, I would usually ask them to customize and pay extra for it because it's a feature that they want right now. So they will have to pay for the customization because we do have a small team. Otherwise, I just say look, we love the idea. We're going to put it in our back burner on a backlog. And at some point, we're going to go back to it. Because the thing is, especially if you have a small team, there's only so much you can ship. And what Sam said, I second that in terms of the team needs rest and the team needs to be able to work on sprints and finish that. So if you're always adding features that a small group wants, and especially if we're talking about SaaS solutions that whatever you do usually applies to every single customers, the question comes back to how complicated can your solution get if you start saying yes to every single feature that a small group of users want, right? So it's that balance too.
Thank you for that. Krupa, anything to add there?
No, I don't have too much to add on top of what Ingrid mentioned. That's exactly right, is that you have to be pretty focused in your priorities. Otherwise, if you say yes to everything, they will be unable to ship anything, essentially. But I think there are some creative ways, the customer could pay for it. You can find, if it's a tech product that has very knowledgeable group of consultants and developers, you can potentially, find other companies or other teams who can help you build some of these things independent of your team being completely sidetracked. And then, of course, how do you go to market? Do you support it long term? All these questions do come up, but it goes into, are you a consumer startup? Are you B2B, software as a service kind of a startup? What is your customer's willingness to be okay with beta testing and trying things out as it's going on? Those are all little things that will play a big role in it, because none of us say no to customers, at the end of the day, but and none of us will probably say no. It just means it's going to be delayed in terms of when it's going to be arrive. So I think just there's some creative things we have to keep in mind.
Thank you for that. Sam, the next question is perfect for your experience. So Greg asks, how might any of the insights that you all have shared so far differ when it's a hardware product in a startup context? So I think what we're getting at is hardware, certainly less flexibility on some of those elements than software. So anything you can share there?
It's a big question. I guess the one thing I would say at a high level is in a hardware business, it's typically in a hardware business, what you actually mean is it's a hardware-based business, and it typically has a software experience built on top of it. So what you're really dealing with is a business that has two camps. One is the team that's building the hardware, and one team that's building the software. I think the biggest thing you can do as an organization to increase your chance of success in a complex business like that is really making sure that you can drive hardware decisions from a customer's perspective. So that means going from the customer, down to the software level, down to the hardware level, and as deep as you need to go to really be able to understand, when I'm making hardware decisions, how do I inform those by actual customer insights or customer, what we want to achieve for the customer. It's very easy as a hardware business to think that the hardware, or look at the hardware and discuss the hardware in a way that is removed from the customer, and think more about specs versus what customers need. And so I'd encourage you as much as possible to try to spend the time
to align specs to needs where you can, and then have conversations at that level, and that will hopefully keep the whole organization, not just the hardware part of the organization, aligned on like what you need to do and what decisions you need to make.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, Krupa, I'm going to go over to you. You certainly brought to life the benefits of scaling with Firebase. Can you share an example or two of startups who you've seen kind of be able to leverage Firebase and transform using the technology?
Absolutely. There are quite a number actually, that I can pick on, but the one I'm going to choose is one that, is really relevant based on the pandemic and COVID-19, and just the massive changes that all of us have gone through as a result of it. And so one I want to call out is, I think it's the e-learning, e-education platform called Classkick. When COVID-19 kind of forced schools to close, what Classkick had provided, now they needed to onboard thousands of teachers and school administrators and students very quickly to their platform. And they built it on top of Firebase and Google Cloud, which kind of meant that they were able to scale to meet this demand and spend more time focusing on delivering a good experience for all these new users, as opposed to fiddling with the backend details and making sure that their infrastructure was able to keep up to speed. And there are many cases that we've seen over the years in terms of just how much our hybrid distributed workforce needs have caused many companies who have traditional areas in this space to now have to think about how do we cater to, how do we scale, how do we make all this work. I'm sure if we look at case studies on even our video teleconferencing solutions we have right now, I'm pretty sure they have really good data on how much traffic and how much volume and how much scaling they need to do as a part of this. So I think there's a lot of learnings we can dig into.
Awesome. Thank you for that example. Ingrid, I'm going to go to a question for you. So as a startup founder yourself, the audience is interested in knowing what your product management team looks like and what kind of processes you have for building your products.
Yeah, so today we have a small team and I play the project manager role, but it's a role that I like to play. So it's one of the ones that I'm hardest to let go of a little bit as a founder. And today, the way that it looks like is that I meet with my engineering team at least once a week on Mondays and then on Fridays, not to necessarily change the sprint, because the sprints can be anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, but actually to check in and see if they need anything from me, especially with my busy schedule as a founder, and see if there's anything that they need to clarify. As well as before I talk to the tech team, so with the engineering team, I also have a meeting with the head of engineering team, with the head of customer experience, so we can agree if there's anything that we need to ship in priority for a specific customer, or if there's a bug that we need to fix right away. And then we can talk to the engineering team and kind of draw out what our next couple weeks are going to look like. And then on the day-to-day basis, we do check daily check-ins where I have a time for them on my schedule that they can just connect with me, ask if they have any questions, and follow through with that.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to ask a part 2 to that question. How do you think you will know, because I'm sure many folks in the audience are in the same position, how do you think you will know when you need to hand off that PM role officially?
It's going to be soon. And I know already, because it's the thing is that I know that my team needs support, and we are actually going to start looking for a PM too. So I'll let you know how it goes. But because as much as I love to do that part of the job, there's so many other things that I have to focus. And I do think that as a founder, our focus has to be on growing the business. And sometimes if we keep those things, and I'm calling myself out here, if we keep those things to ourselves, even though we like it, what happens is that the team might not feel as supported, because you are the one that has the limited time and can't always be there for them. So
thank you for that. Okay, I know we're nearing the end of our session, so I'm going to ask one last question for each of you that I'd love your thoughts on from Elton, a more general question. Elton is looking for any online, or I'll just say any resources at all that folks watching today can turn to better understand how to kind of develop their product better and to develop their product management skills. So I'll start with you, Sam. I know you already pointed to ShapeUp. Anything else that has been helpful for you along your journey?
I think generally speaking, ShapeUp is a specific methodology about how to do things and how to change your mindset about how to do things, specifically as it relates to current agile methodologies. It really adds a different take on that whole process. I'd say outside of that, the only thing I could really suggest is, reading a lot about, social psychology, trying to understand how people work, trying to understand how people interact and communicate, and all of that, helps you get a bigger picture on like the overall ways that you can understand your customers. So that's, for me, that's kind of what I lean into as much as possible is when I get a chance. I know there's not a lot of time, especially for founders, but, spending that time reading and really getting a larger macro picture on the world and specifically on people.
Thank you. Karupa, I'll hand the same question over to you. Any kind of go-to frameworks or resources that you found helpful?
Yeah, one of the big areas is always networking. There are a lot of meetups, a lot of social groups within larger areas where startup founders and other people who work in this area like to just chat. And it's great to just learn from what people have tried, what their successes have been, and what their failures have been as well, because always over-index on successes. But it's always good to look at what worked and why didn't something work, and learning more about what can we do to maybe not make those same mistakes. And the other point would be to add to what Sam answered earlier. It's really around human-centered design and research, and there are a lot of great books that talk about how do we make sure what we're building is the right one. And many of them are often counterintuitive to how we might think of, as creators of products, how a consumer might look into that as well. So definitely those are some of the things to definitely read into, especially if it's something unknown to you. I definitely go for that one, because we always tend to have a bias towards reading the things that we are excited about or we know more about already. But kind of the earlier comment about we want to hire people that are not quite like us, that same applies to learning as well. There's a lot of things that, for example, personally, I'm not very good at marketing. So I do spend a lot of time reading about marketing because it is an important part of how you reach out to customers. So a lot of resources there.
Thank you. I think the perfect balance between both of your answers, between seeking out, frameworks and methodologies, but not forgetting the real world examples that are equally as important. Ingrid, I know you have a thirst for learning. Not only are you a founder, but you're always in school also. So anything that you've gravitated towards in your kind of learning journey, academic or not, that's been helpful?
I would say that the Google has a project management certificate for people that have no basis in project management. That would be a good one. I already had experience with project management, but it was a very good resource for me. I would say just learning about Agile in general. It sounds very dry when you start learning it, but it's important. And the thing is, if you're a non-technical founder as a product manager, learning how to speak engineers and developers language and how they communicate. And I cannot stress that enough in terms of how, because sometimes you're trying to express a feature and they do something completely different. And it's not their fault, is that you're not communicating in terms of technology and what they necessarily need to do. So communications in general and learning how to communicate through the process of tech and engineering is super important. And there's a lot of resources and books. Books is always my go-to. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all, honestly, so much to Drew, Sam, Karupa, and Ingrid for spending your time with us and sharing your insights. That's all the time we have for questions today, but all of today's content will be made available on demand on our Founder Fridays website next week, and we'll share it with all of our registrants via email as well. Here are some links to Google's Small Business Resource Hub, Think with Google, and our Founder Fridays on-demand content, where you'll find all of our lightning talks on today's topic and all of our previous content. And next month, we're talking about designing for your customers with UX. So you can register online right now at g.co/founderfridays. And finally, we update the format and content of Founder Fridays ongoing based on the direct feedback that we receive from you all. So please do, if you have time, take 2 minutes to complete the survey after today's session. We really appreciate it. So for any questions about Founder Fridays or the resources, you can always contact us directly at founder-fridays@google.com. One last thank you to all of our speakers and certainly to all of you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.